Hello, this is the first lecture for the course, the Computational Core of Social Cognition. My name is John Bolander. This is part of the Polymath project of Michael Barnathan. And first of all, I would like to say a little bit about myself. I already told you my name, it's John Bolander. And my background is mostly in philosophy. I have a PhD in philosophy from Columbia University. I am, however, very much interested in cognition, as philosophers increasingly are, it seems. I taught for a while in Ankara, Turkey. I taught at a couple universities there, Bilkent University, and also Middle East Technical Universities in their philosophy departments. I was also a visiting fellow at the Rotman Institute of Philosophy at Western University in Ontario, and also the philosophy department at Princeton. Now, for this course, there is a written assignment I would like for you to produce, a 10-page paper, double-spaced, with standard scholarly sized font and margins and so forth. And when you've done that, well, first of all, I would like for you to run possible topics by me. Just based on what we've been reading, based on what's covered in the syllabus and so forth, I would be interested in whatever sort of topic seizes your imagination and you feel like writing about. But run it by me first. I mean, don't just produce a paper out of the blue, please. Propose an idea to me first, and we can talk about it. And you can contact me through this email address that I have here on the screen, bolander@rousseau-etc.com. And then finally, when you're ready with the paper, you can also send it to that email address as an attachment. Now, to get started with the subject matter, the course is about interpersonal cognition, which I define as how one understands, recognizes, and evaluates social relations. I could use the term social cognition. Perhaps I should, or perhaps sometimes I will use the term social cognition. But in the social cognition literature, that term is often used as a synonym for what's called folk psychology or theory of mind, which roughly speaking is person perception, perceiving other people and trying to figure out what they're thinking. That's often what the term social cognition is used to refer to. And there's some controversy as to whether or not animals are capable of social cognition in that sense. Animals are capable of social cognition in the sense that concerns me in this class. And so I want to talk about more than just theory of mind or folk psychology. So I'm using a different term, interpersonal cognition. This is also something that baboons are capable of, dolphins are capable of, chimpanzees are capable of. And also the word person may be a little bit of a misnomer. But other species have social relations, they understand them, they recognize them, they evaluate them, even if they do not think about other minds. They still have interpersonal cognition in the sense that I'm using the term. So that's why I'm using this broad term. Okay. Now, one theme of the class, one thing I'm going to try to convince you of, although it's great if you don't agree with me, but I'm going to try to convince you that interpersonal cognition is computational, which immediately raises the question, what does that mean? What does the word computation mean? Defining the word computation is actually a difficult thing. In fact, there's a conference coming up soon in April, somewhere in England. I forget the location exactly. And the whole theme of the conference is trying to figure out a good definition of the word computational, especially as it applies to the mind performing computations. So it's a word that's actually somewhat vague. As this course goes along, we will clarify the meaning of it. I mean, we'll zero in on a specific meaning as to what I'm getting at when I say computational. To jump ahead a little bit, when I say computational, I mean unbounded recursion. We'll talk about that later. Okay. For now, let's just begin with a rough idea of what computational is. If you've read William Abler, and I hope that you have read Abler before this lecture, if you haven't, then read Abler's article right after the lecture, please. Abler talks about particulate systems. Roughly speaking, that's what I mean by computational, a particulate system. If there are mental particulate systems, they are, in some sense, computational. So, a point that's made in this class is that interpersonal cognition, as well as language and also counting, are each a particulate system, psychologically particulate. Now that raises questions as to how they relate to each other. I mean, is one an offshoot of the other? Or did they just evolve separately to be computational? Does each one just happen to be computational? Or is language the culprit, so to speak, and counting and interpersonal cognition are offshoots of language? Or maybe language and counting are offshoots of interpersonal cognition? These are questions to be addressed as we go along. Okay? Now, moving to the next slide. We want to determine the basic principles of interpersonal cognition. We want to know how the mind does it. How do we think about social relations? And the first step is to take clues anywhere that we can find them. Now here is what I take to be a really important observation. One finds a great deal of variety within and across cultures, varieties of social structures. We're very struck by these varieties. In fact, we debate them. We get angry about it. If you don't like someone else's social system, you complain about it. But the fundamental fact is that there is a lot of variety. Moving to the next slide. There's a lot of variety within a culture, or within a society for that matter. There's social structure within the family. There's social structure of some sort within a train and public transportation. People interact in a train. There's a social structure at a formal commencement, an academic commencement. There's social structure at a party, and each one's different. A wedding is a kind of social structure. A football game is a kind of social structure. Right? A political rally is a kind of social structure. They're all very different. They're strikingly different from each other. Right? In the course of one's day, you encounter remarkably different social expectations. On to the next slide. There's also a great deal of variety across cultures. In fact, this may have been the first thing that occurred to you when I spoke of social variety. That there's a great deal of variety across different societies. And people will often judge some societies as better than others as a result of this. But the basic fact is just that they're really different from each other. And they're also very compound. I mean, any given society consists of a large number of smaller social structures combined together. Now that raises a question. What produces variety? Answering this question provides an interesting clue as to what the basic principle of interpersonal cognition might be. Social structures are not the only place we find variety, though. We also find them in biology. That's why you're now seeing a picture of a biologist, Ronald Fisher. Fisher noted that the wide variety of biological species suggests that inheritance depends upon the combination of objects. Combination of objects to form novel structures. When combined with another object, the object does not lose its identity or essentially change. And today, that's how we understand genetics. The genome consists of alleles. An allele retains its identity within different genomes. Even stretches of the genetic code serve as constituents that can appear in different codes. So a mouse and a human being, parts of their genetic codes will be the same. They share some stretches of code. That's because the genetic code is a combinatorial system. It is, to use a slightly different term, a particulate system. Yeah? A particulate system is any system that combines discrete objects to form compound objects. And Lego blocks are an illustration, and that's why you're seeing a picture of Lego blocks. The objects do not change their intrinsic character upon combination. Each Lego block retains its shape and its intrinsic, or rather internal properties, when it's combined with other objects. But it forms a novel object. It forms a new shape when you put them together. A particulate system has the capacity to increase the range of differences. You expect novelty from a particulate system, at least potentially. The immune system is an illustration of a particulate system. Yeah. So, how many genes are there for a human being? Somewhere between 20,000 and 25,000. Now consider the immune system. The human body can synthesize more than 100 million antibody proteins. Now what that means is that there cannot be a gene for each antibody because there aren't enough genes. You have 20,000 is a much lower number than 100 million, right? So to be responsive to the vast range of potential infections, the immune system must be particulate. It must involve combination. Combination is what gives us novelty. It's what gives us potentially greater and greater novelty. Now contrast particulate systems with blending systems. This is in William Abler, by the way. This is Abler's point, contrasting these two systems. A blending system is any system that mixes substances, resulting in an averaging out of differences. So, for example, if you mix blue paint with yellow paint, you get green paint, which is a kind of compromise between the difference between the blue and the yellow. Now, Abler's point, William Abler's point, is that in a blending system, differences are averaged out. So if you have nothing but a blending system, ultimately everything turns out to be gray. Everything tends toward homogeneity. And that's how Fisher knew that biology, on some basic level, could not be a blending system, because you don't find that in biology. When you look at the tree of life, the biological evolutionary tree of life, you find greater and greater diversity over time. Just the opposite of what you would see in a blending system. So Fisher knew that the folk view of biology had to be wrong. And what do I mean by the folk view of biology? I mean the kind of intuitive, commonsensical, but obviously wrong view, that the child resembles the parents because the child contains a mixture of the mother's blood and the father's blood. That's an old folk view. I mean, intuitively it seems right, but of course that can't be right. If that were true, then sexual reproduction would tend toward sameness. That's not what you find in the Tree of Life. So, in producing great variety, natural selection must operate upon a system that combines units to form structures. In other words, natural selection must operate upon a particulate system. Technology is a particulate system, and this plays a role in the evolutionary branching of technology. If you open a jet engine, which is what that is in the picture, by the way, if you open a jet engine, you find components. And if you were to open certain machines that predated the jet engine, you would find many of the same components. This point was made by Arthur, who wrote a book recently on the nature of technology. Oh, I forget the name of the book, but I'll tell you later. Arthur wrote a book recently on the nature of technology, and he makes this point. Basically, I don't think he uses Abler's terminology. I don't think Arthur talks about, I don't think he uses the word particulate, for example. But basically what he's saying is that technology is particulate. Technology exhibits what William Abler calls retrievability. So let's go to the next slide, which illustrates Abler. I couldn't find a good picture of Abler, so here's a picture of his book. Now, I want to read something from page 3 of Abler's article, which I hope you've read by now. On page 3, Abler talks about retrievability. Retrievability is a property of particulate systems, quoting Abler, when the constituents of self-diversifying systems combine with one another, the constituents retain their original identities, a property which I call retrievability. Like sustained variation, the retrievability property of the constituents of self-diversifying systems indicate that such systems are based on particles, because the individual identity of blending constituents will be obliterated by the process of combining and averaging. So you know that technology is not a blending system, or at least not wholly a blending system. It's at least partially particulate, because you find the same components in different machines. A really obvious example of that, apart from compressors in jet engines and industrial blower units, a really obvious illustration is batteries. So, you buy a bunch of AA batteries in the store, and you don't know what you might be using them for, because there are a lot of machines that take AA batteries, right? So that's retrievability. You also find retrievability in language. The obvious illustration would be words. That's not the only illustration, but that's the obvious one. The same word can appear in different phrases, in different sentences. You also find it in sociality. The family, to take one example, the nuclear family. You can find essentially the same nuclear family in societies that are otherwise very different. So that's retrievability. Societies appear to be particulate. And I want to argue, that that's because our interpersonal cognition is itself particulate, very much like our language, and very much like the cognition that underlies our use of technology. Now, both blending systems and particulate systems produce novelty. However, a blending system only produces novelty in the short run. It eventually tends towards sameness, toward homogeneity. By contrast, a particulate system can potentially produce novelty indefinitely. And there's a beautiful illustration of this on page 2 of Abler's article, which I really wasn't able to put into the slideshow. So I would like for you to look at it now. If you don't have Abler's article in front of you, maybe you could pause this presentation and get the article. and then go to page 2, figure 1, there's a really nice visual illustration of the difference between blending systems versus particulate systems. Looking at figure 1 on page 2, the upper tier of the figure illustrates a blending system. You see a white circle and a black circle combined to form a gray circle. That's novelty. That's the kind of novelty you get in a blending system. The only problem with it, assuming that you value novelty, and I assume you probably do, the only problem with a blending system is that in the long run, everything is going to be gray. In the long run, it erases novelty. It obliterates it. By contrast, look at the second tier. You have two inputs, as you do in the case of the blending system. You have a hexagon and you have a square, and they're combined to form a new shape, which is strikingly different from the two initial shapes. And as you keep combining elements in the particulate system, you have increasingly interesting shapes. Not only greater and greater novelty, potentially, but also a lot of real complexity. Particulate systems produce complexity. Our technology is complex, our social structures are complex, our sentences are complex. And evidently they're all particulate. Now, moving on to the next slide, interpersonal cognition. The wide variety of social structures that we find suggests that there's a particulate system for combining what I call primes into complex structures. Now, prime is a term from linguistics. A prime is an elementary unit which enters into combinations. Okay, so I'm using the word prime instead of atom, let's say, because the word atom might suggest a direct connection with physics, which might be a little bit confusing. Now, the great variety of social structures suggests that there are primes in social relational cognition, just as there are evidently primes in language. Not necessarily words, because a word can be very complex, but let's say morphemes, or maybe even something simpler than morphemes, maybe what are called features. But at some level in language you find primes. You have to, because it's obviously particulate. And in interpersonal cognition, there are also primes. One thing that we need to do in this course is figure out what are the primes of interpersonal cognition. Now, I don't want to leave the topic of blending systems just yet. I've been saying that interpersonal cognition is computational in the sense of being particulate, and you might think that blending systems don't interest me. Actually, they do interest me. And one really important thing that we need to keep in mind is that the mind is not a single organ. The mind is a combination of organs. The mind itself is particulate in a way. It's a combination of organs, and there is no guarantee that all of the mental organs operate according to the same principles. So when I say that interpersonal cognition is computational, and that language is computational, and that counting is computational, that the cognition underlying technology is computational, I'm not implying that everything in the mind is computational. That would be hasty. First of all, let me talk about why it's reasonable to view the mind as consisting of multiple organs. The mind is not a single organ. We know this empirically because various mental capacities can selectively break down. There's a condition called prosopagnosia, in which one is no longer able to recognize faces. But a person with prosopagnosia can, nonetheless, be able to recognize shapes perfectly well. They can be a skilled painter and still not be able to recognize faces. So there's some mental faculty that is specifically designed, and when I say design, I'm not referring to intelligent design or anything like that. When I say design, I mean structure. presumably resulting from natural selection, or maybe natural selection in combination with physics, something like that. Yeah. But in some sense of the word designed, there's a faculty of the mind which is designed for recognizing faces. There's lots of evidence of this sort of thing. There's a famous case of a man which maybe you've heard of. His name was Phineas Gage. He lived in the late 19th century. He worked for the railway. He helped build rail lines. He was tamping some dynamite into a hole. As he was doing that, the dynamite exploded, and the tamping rod entered the front part of his head, and it went through part of his brain and flew out the top of his head. So he suffered an injury to the front of his brain, right above the nose. He experienced a kind of psychological damage that was remarkably pinpoint. He lost his sense of social propriety, including his conscience. He had no sense of etiquette and no sense of right or wrong. He was, that is, from that point on, a very awful and atrocious person. But otherwise, he was perfectly normal. He wasn't mentally retarded, for example. His general intelligence was unimpaired. There are also cases of people whose language skills are just on a genius level. They can learn many languages fluently in short periods of time, but they're mentally retarded. These sorts of evidence suggest that the mind is not a single organ, but a variety of organs. And I emphasize that because, as I said, we should not assume that just because one form of cognition is computational, that all forms of cognition are computational. That does not follow. And even what I am calling interpersonal cognition may only be partly computational. There may be other aspects of it which are not computational, which are blending systems. Or, to speak of a more broader category, analog systems. Blending systems are a subclass, a special case of analog systems. And apparently some psychological systems are analog, so it's worth talking about this. In an analog system, novelty results from changing position in a continuous space. And blending systems are an illustration of that. Even though prima facie you might not think so, actually they are. The result of blending white paint and red paint can be represented as a point on a finite one-dimensional space. A finite one-dimensional space is a bounded line. So the result of mixing red paint with white paint can be represented as a point on a line. Purely red paint corresponds to one end of the line. Purely white paint corresponds to the other end. Different proportions of blending correspond to different shades of pink. And they also correspond to various in-between points on the line. So the transition from, let's say, pure red to some particular shade of pink is a kind of novelty. And that novelty can be represented as a change in position on the line. Right? Now, blending three colors of paint can be represented using a two-dimensional space. And novelty would then correspond to change of position within a triangle. Blending four paints would correspond to a three-dimensional space. Blending five paints would correspond to a four-dimensional space, and so on. Now, animal communication systems, some of them are analog, and even some human communication systems are analog, which is not surprising because humans are animals. Now, for example, to take a human example, let's start with a human example. A human being can raise its voice to communicate degree of anger. And in doing that, the human conveys a new degree of anger by changing the volume of the voice. So in that case, one is moving to a new position within a one-dimensional space of loudness. Now let's consider a non-human example, the European robin. The ethologist William Thorpe noted that the European robin trills more or less quickly to reflect its degree of willingness to defend its territory, which is actually similar to the human case I just mentioned, because in both cases, change of position within a one-dimensional space indicates potential aggression. So that's analog. Another example, the waggle dance of the honeybee is also analog. The degree of the waggling line of the bee's dance in relation to the perpendicular indicates the angle of the direction to food or water in relation to the sun. Change in the angle within this two-dimensional space corresponds to new information. So basically the bee is pointing toward the food. And one points within a continuous space, in this case a two-dimensional space. Now, the philosophers David Braden Mitchell and Frank Jackson have suggested an approach to understanding the mind, which is analog, in fact, although I don't think they call it that. They don't say it's analog, but it is. It's what they call the map story, or the map account. They prefer the word story rather than theory. That's actually their word. I mean, I'm not using that word to make fun of them. That's the word they use. And in fact, I'm sure they're right to some extent. It's not unreasonable. Not an unreasonable approach to the mind. Now, they try to understand mental representation and thought processes in terms of inner mental maps. And these maps constitute an analog system, or a group of analog systems. On a mappish approach, mental representations are continuous. They are not digital. In other words, they're not particulate. Being continuous, a map contains, at least in principle, infinitely many points. And they contrast the map approach with language. They want to suggest that language is not language-like, the mind is not language-like, or at least they want to play down the extent to which thought is language-like. And they want to say that instead thought is largely mappish or map-like. Quoting Braden, Mitchell, and Jackson, they say, passages of prose have minimum representational units, whereas maps do not. Okay? Now, since each point in a map represents something, a map in principle stores an infinite quantity of information. So, a map cannot represent anything at all unless it represents a lot. And that's in contrast to a sentence. A sentence can convey only a small amount of information. A map is not like that. Either a map represents nothing or it represents a whole lot. Okay? So the map is virtually synonymous, or the map story rather, is virtually synonymous with the view that there are analog mental processes. The spaces of analog thought systems are maps in the sense of Braden, Mitchell, and Jackson. Now, in a mappish system, there are two sources of novelty. One is pointer movement, a pointer being the indicator of a thing's location on a map. The pointer can move. That's a source of novelty. Another source of novelty is the deformation of the map. The map itself can change shape or shapes, patterns, within the map can change. So like a representation of a mountain might move around within a map. That would be a source of novelty. Now, if one's view of the mind is completely mappish, if it's entirely mappish, then deformation turns out to be a special case of pointer movement. Why? Well, because a map deforms by itself changing location within a space of possible maps. In other words, the map is moving within a second-order map. Right? Deformation of a map is change of position within a higher-order map. So it turns out that all novelty within a mappish approach is ultimately pointer movement. Now, I contend that purely mappish systems are not a good explanation of novelty. And so they are not a good explanation of the variety that one finds in social structures. This is not to say that interpersonal cognition does not involve maps at all. It probably does involve maps in some capacity, but it cannot be completely mappish. There must be something particular going on in interpersonal cognition. Because simply changing position within defined limits is not a source of interesting variation. Now, changing position in multiple spaces simultaneously could be a source of interesting variation. But this would actually be a kind of particulate system with each space serving as a particle. So I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. Consider a screen, like a computer screen or a television screen, composed of pixels. And each pixel can change in color along a continuous dimension. So each pixel is analog. Well, let's assume that it is. Assume that each pixel is analog. However, the combination of pixels is particulate. And it's because of that, it's because of the particulate nature of a combination of pixels that a computer screen or a television screen can potentially exhibit very interesting variety, because it could picture almost anything, right? Mere change of position may appear to be a source of interesting variation, but that's only because the map itself has a lot of variety already built into it. And that simply raises the question of where that variety came from. Very plausibly, in fact almost certainly, a particulate system is a factor in how humans produce a wide variety of social structures. But this does not it does not rule out the possibility of a hybrid system. So consider the following. In fact, Braden, Mitchell, and Jackson consider the possibility of a hybrid system. The weather maps that appear appear on television, for example. I mean, you have a map here, but you also have, numbers, in this case, indicating temperatures. Each one of those numbers is a natural number. The set of natural numbers is a discrete system. It's particulate in the sense. In fact, one definition of particulate is that something can be counted using natural numbers, right? Okay. You could also imagine words in place of the numbers, or sentences in place of the numbers. That would be a particulate system, because language is particulate. But it's combined with a map, which is analog. So an analog system and a particulate system can be combined. And in cognition they probably are. In fact, one point that I want to make is that in interpersonal cognition you find a combination of analog an analog system and also a particulate system. So when I talk about the computational core of interpersonal cognition, I'm only talking about one part of interpersonal cognition. There are analog things going on there as well. In the case of language, it's really easy to see this. If you're talking to someone, your use of language is particulate because there are words. The words in a sentence can be counted using natural numbers. In contrast, for example, to fractions. So the number of words in a sentence might be 5 or 6 or 7, but you're not going to have 5.5 words in a sentence, right? Or 6 2/3 words in a sentence. Right? So the relevant numbers here are natural numbers, not real numbers. So you have something particulate and combinatorial in the composition of words to form phrases and sentences. At the same time, however, in using a sentence and speaking, you may raise your voice in anger. I hope not, but you might. You might raise your voice in anger. And the increase in volume reflects your degree of anger, and that's analog. Right? That's like the European robin trilling faster to indicate its degree of willingness to defend its territory. So there, in language use and speech, you find the combination of an analog system and also a particulate system. And these are both evidently psychological at their core. There's something analog going on in the psychology of language, and there's also something particulate going on in the psychology of language. And I'm sure that that's also true in interpersonal cognition. So quoting Braden, Mitchell, and Jackson, the weather maps that appear in the daily papers also contain words and numbers, so we should not forget the possibility that internal representation works by a combination of dynamic mental maps and mentalese. Mentalese is a word that's used to indicate the language of thought. And the language of thought, or mentalese, all that really means is that thought is a particulate system, which indeed some of it is. Maybe not all of it, but some of it. Now, okay, this is a bit redundant because I've made this point before. The mind is a collection of interacting powers, that is, mental faculties. One should not assume that all mental faculties use the same principles. Now, focusing on the particulate nature of interpersonal cognition, one thing that we need to do to arrive at a deep understanding of anything is to idealize. And idealizing means that you leave things out. It's initially counterintuitive. One would think that to have a good understanding of something, you bring in all factors. You bring in everything. You don't leave things out. But the fact is that the scientific revolution began with Galileo because Galileo realized that he had to idealize. In fact, the point in laboratories is to idealize. The function of a laboratory is to screen out factors that interfere with the phenomenon you are studying. Okay? So a laboratory is a kind of forced idealization. In our studying of interpersonal cognition, in order to arrive at a deep understanding, we have to idealize. We have to leave certain things out. And even though I will discuss the analog component of interpersonal cognition in this course, I would mainly like to focus on the computational, that is, the particulate aspect of interpersonal cognition. So for long stretches of the course, we'll be focusing on the computational aspect only. And that means that we have to ask the question, what are the primes of interpersonal cognition? In other words, what are the basic elements of interpersonal cognition, which are combined to form complex structures? And that's why I want you to read Alan Page Fisk and Nick Haslam. Even though there are two authors of the article that I would like for you to read next, the theory in question is really Fisk's theory. It's known as relational models theory. And according to Fisk, there are four basic mental models. There are four basic schemes that we use to organize, evaluate, anticipate, and interpret social interactions. And these four models are known as communal sharing, authority ranking, equality matching, and market pricing. Communal sharing means having something in common. Authority ranking is hierarchy. Equality matching is maintaining balance. And market pricing is the use of ratios and rates. There's a great deal of empirical evidence to support relational models theory. It's been tested psychologically in controlled studies, not only within cultures but cross-culturally. And it appears to be true across all societies. It's innate. Whether or not it's genetically innate or the result of brain physics is a deep question that we will address later in this course. But it's innate in the sense that it's not learned. It arises naturally within the organism, these four basic models. Now, the combination of these four basic models into complex structures evidently explains the great deal of variety that one finds both within cultures, within a given culture, and also across cultures. By taking these four basic models and implementing each one in various ways, and by combining them in various ways, one is doing something very similar to what one does in language. By taking the items in one's vocabulary and combining them to form sentences, novel sentences, sentences you've never heard before. Likewise, one can take these social primes, these elementary relational models, and combine them to form structures that you've never encountered before, you've never lived in before. And this is a source, potentially, of great social novelty.